Hi guys, and we are doing another Glasshouse session. This week we have a special guest, Matt. Um, Matt, no last name.
Last name's Goerzen, Goer. Is it not
Gertz.
showing up on your
No,
screen
no,
here?
yeah, no, I can't see it. That's the problem.
Brock hadn't
Sorry.
sounded it out yet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go
the
Goerzen.
Goerzen. Yeah, the first name's pretty easy to pronounce, but the second gets
Matt.
everyone. So yeah.
Matt is joining us. Matt self-identifies as an academic doing, not really sure what he would call it. It's security adjacent. It's not like cybersecurity as we know it, but it is, I think, possibly more interesting than the usual, like just purely technical stuff. Um, I'll pass it over to him in a second, but yeah, we have Dave, Silas, Tanzi, and Pablo, and myself. Um, this week, there's been a bunch of interesting stuff. Microsoft dropped a new paper on how what was it? How Russia failed to do the cyber war, but there was a really, really large amount of cyber war that did happen. Trust us. And apparently, all the reasons that it failed are because of Microsoft policy initiatives. So that's a good thing. There was a public-private partnership, information sharing, and the power of friendship. That is literally what they said. It's because Microsoft has taken the side of Ukraine. That is why Russia has failed. So there you go. Care Bear stare. That'll defeat all the APTs. So that out of the way. Yeah, I guess there's been a bunch of other stuff, but we're not going to be talking about that yet because we want to talk about Hack and Leak, which I guess Matt is not exactly the guest for it. We're waiting for Gabriella, who's going to be joining us shortly. She should be here depending on traffic. Unfortunately, I think she's a little bit late, but Matt, you want to?
Yeah, sure. So I can introduce myself a little bit, but also Bella is, she's trying to connect into the Zoom and having some kind of issue. So she should be here imminently. Yeah, so your introduction was interesting. I'm like, so I actually just, I think what you were referencing was up until, the end of last year, December 31st, I was working at a research nonprofit called Data and Society, where I started out looking at kind of like media manipulation, by various mostly non-state kind of actors, I guess you would say, in the US context, and then kind of moved from that work to doing work studying like kind of socio-technical sort of threats, possible threats to the US Census that was coming up. It's something that we were doing. But then also while doing all of that, I've been developing a lot of like interest in the kind of early history of computer security, particularly how hackers were involved in kind of shaping the agenda of computer security in the 1990s. So I'm actually entering a PhD program at Harvard in September, where I'm going to be exploring that side of it more. So I'm going to be looking at kind of imaginaries of like alternative approaches to computer security, what they could have been, what people were imagining back in the day, what lessons some of those possibilities might have for issues we have today, which sort of people were kind of left outside of the computer security regime that did develop stuff like that. But always I'm very interested in angles onto some of the hard problems, more kind of socio-technical problems that confront us in the current moment. Hack and Leak is maybe one of those interesting ones, and Bella's been doing some really interesting research on that front. So hopefully she'll be with us any moment and she can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, like since you're here and Dave is old, am I, and we remember security in the 90s. So we could talk about that if you want. Like that seems, I'm sure, Tanzi, I think you're ancient like the rest of us, aren't you?
I'm
You
probably the most ancient one.
yeah. Like we're all old and decrepit. We know about these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the question that comes to me to mind, my feeble age-addled mind is,
Who are you people? Where am I? Why am I wearing pants?
This is not my beautiful house. Was the decision? Is it a conscious decision to start at the 90s and go forward, or because I mean, computer auditing and the likes of Don Parker and those sorts of things go back way back. So I just curious about the.
Yeah, well, I guess I was kind of so. I think the impetus for Bill and I being invited here was Dave had seen a report that Bill and I co-authored that was released by my former workplace, Data Society, in I think it was in mid-December last year, and it's kind of looking at the process of hacker professionalization. So the move of like the underground, some of the underground types, of course, into the a more professional workforce, or whether it's starting their own companies or becoming
selling out.
Laborers. The great selling out. That's one way to think of it, maybe. So yeah, I mean, I referenced the 90s just because that was really our focus on this report, and up until I was particularly interested in the role of hackers, or these kind of anti-establishment types being involved in shaping computer security to some extent through various means, and so that's kind of what we looked at in that report. But I'm certainly interested in earlier topics as well. I mean, I'm really interested, for example, in like the debates around whether passwords on passwords are even a good thing, stuff like that. Hi, Biella.
Hi, sorry about that. Zoom was really acting up. I had to restart my computer.
No problem. I blame Silas. It's probably his.
No, blame Apple or Zoom or me.
So welcome. We started off just discussing basically the hackers in the 90s, which I think like Dave was corporate, or sorry, agency, not quite the same. Tanji was, I don't know, he could tell me, but he'd have to kill me. And
well, I think I actually do have quite a few questions based on some of the work that you've put out. Like, I pasted one of the segments from one of your recent pieces. Actually, I think it's from one of Bella's pieces. We should actually have Bella introduce herself first before we start drilling them with crazy questions.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Biella, also known as Gabriella, and I'm an anthropologist. And I've been studying and researching and teaching on various cultures of hacking, from open source to hacktivism to security. And I'm really happy to be here, and sorry, I'm a bit late.
One of the recent, I mean, I think Matt's known for a couple different things, in particular, the paper called Entanglements and Exploits, looking at socio-technological security as an analytical framework, which I thought was a really good piece with a different Gabrielle, which is very confusing.
Yeah,
and then
I only co-author papers with Gabrielles or Gabriellas. Yeah, that's a policy.
It's a thing for sure. And I really felt like a lot of this was a follow-on from some of the early, like, speaking of 90s hackers, like, I don't know if you guys have read Clay Shirky's books, who was really prominent in that era, trying to understand the rise of social media in general. But then there's also, Gabriella has a whole BBC series as well, on early hackers. And to me, it was on early, really nice hackers, right? So I think one thing about both of the dimensions of this thing is, like, even when you're studying trolls, no one wants to talk about Weave, for example, or anywhere where this starts coming up, like the dark side of the trolling, why are there so many Nazi furry hackers, right? Like, no one wants to talk about this stuff. And I found that was very interesting. Like, even when you do anthropological studies have to be about sometimes the human sacrifices.
Sure,
right?
sure. I will say though, my book actually, for better or for worse, features Weave. And I met him and I interacted with him. And I certainly didn't make it the focus, you know, and in certain ways, I presented him as a kind of foil to Anonymous, insofar as he was terrifying. He wasn't anonymous. He was doing things for his own fame, right? But I think you raise an interesting point, because I think researchers become polluted when they do research on those topics. It's very, very hard. I mean, unless you just are denouncing them, which we should be denounced. But nevertheless, we're trying to also understand them in a slightly deeper way. You kind of have to go beyond denunciations, and it puts researchers in a tough spot.
There's some interesting things just bouncing on that, which is you're talking about like the professionalization of hackers, but as I remember, quite a large number of them were just sort of really angry teenage boys, myself excluded, of course, who was one of the calm and sensible ones at the time. But, you know, like there's not much that you can professionalize about people who are like literally just, you know, swearing at each other and attacking each other, like, you know, all the IRC wars and stuff like that had zero contribution to the greater security industry or whatever. But it was a massive part of the culture. Like it was huge. So I'm kind of curious about how you deal with that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed like some of the response to the report on Twitter has like some of the more interesting pushback. We actually haven't gotten that much pushback. I don't know if that's because some people have had pushback that's so tremendous that they can't articulate it in 255 words or whatever, or whether there's some other reason. I'd like to know either way. But one of the interesting, you know, threads I've seen on Twitter is being people, basically contesting this idea that this was even professionalization, and like the, you know, what is the meaning of professionalization? I think like we were really using it just in like this, you know, very literal way of like hacker, you know, these people going into labor workforces in one form or another and getting paid for it. But there's definitely, then the question of like, what is the, you know, what does professionalization imply, some type of respectability, or is that kind of what you're getting
I mean, you're right. It's just that the thing is, like, at the time there was a sort of grow up and get a job as like one path that a lot of people took. And it was sort of very, very clear when that was happening. Like, I think it was around the first Pwn to Own, there was a thing with K2 and Dino, where like Dino and K2 stayed up all night and wrote an exploit for Safari on Mac. And the prize for that was you got to keep the Mac and $10,000. And I can't remember which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was K2 who he took the money and he gave Dino the Mac. It's like, there you go, kid, you know, good for you. You get the prize. I'll just take this money. You don't like, and I think that was like, Dino was slightly younger and he was also professional. I could be getting it wrong. So I apologize to Dino if you know,
K2 is interesting because he doesn't get mentioned in these hacker histories. What you get mentioned is the loft. Right. And a lot of our friends are in the loft. I know a lot of great people in the loft, but I would say there is a humongous iceberg of people who are, in my opinion, more important to the real hacking world. And K2 built ADM Mutate. Who's ADM? Right? Like, where did all the ADM people go? All of these threads don't get pulled because they're not BBC friendly in a way.
Right. No, for sure.
And became Qualys. You know, like,
although I want to go back to your first comment, but to the ADM thing, I mean, part of it is certainly the contacts that we had, the fact that, you know, the loft from the beginning was so media savvy, right, and public. And, you know, certainly during our research, ADM, TESO, other kind of also European-based groups, it was clear that they were really important. We mentioned them in passing, and we did actually try pretty hard to interview some ADM folks. It was difficult. I'm still hopeful for the book we can do so, because it was clear that everyone was like, they're the best ones around exploit writing, which we do mention. And yet, of course, the focus is not them, right? But there are like challenges to reaching them for certain reasons. We do have some contacts, but hopefully just talking about this and making this public will kind of grease the wheels for us to be able to do that research, because I completely agree around that.
Yeah, I just want to add really quickly too, like Biella said, like in this report, we were really focusing on the role of spectacle, like kind of hacker-led produced spectacle, and like it's the ability of spectacle to kind of force something onto the agenda, right? And ADM, it seemed like, you know, they were very well known in the scene, but they didn't have that same interface with the media. I'm working on something right now, a follow-up based on some of the research we did, and it'll maybe just make its way into a book if we write that, but yeah, that's kind of looking at the anti-sec movement, which, you know, was one of the first kind of backlashes to professionalization.
First
anti-security, rather. Anti-security.
Right, okay, yeah. The anti-sec
and, yeah. And
because
and of course, you know, ADM featured into that. I don't know if Kate too was involved in that in particular, but yeah.
I don't remember, but
well, I actually, the thing I like about ADM Mutate, to be fair, is that every IDS is still in most ways very vulnerable to the core theory. So he came out and he's like, look, what if the shellcode was generated by a program that randomized it all over the place? And for 10 years thereafter, it worked perfectly well on every, like all of the best intrusion detection systems. And I think that's fascinating in a way. It's like, what do we truly want to believe versus what we believe, right? Because security theater is in some ways the opposite of security, and we are very vulnerable to that.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like old things that work, so like Scott wrote Burn-Eye back in, I believe it was 99 or 98. I think it was published in 99, but so, oh, Dave is being very mean. All right, so like Burn-Eye was written back in like 98 or 99. And like I worked with Scott to write the FRAC article about it and how to do like protections for ELF binaries on Linux and whatever. And if you read like modern reports on like APTs that have got like seriously advanced tooling where they encrypt their binaries that they leave behind on boxes, like today, they're using Burn-Eye. Like it is, I mean, it's been updated slightly, but it's Burn-Eye. Like he never added any of the really impressive things. And even back then, back in 99, I broke it. I showed like, these are the problems with it. But now, like, yeah, like it is trivial to bypass in some ways, but not in others. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of just old stuff from like the old scene that it was inconvenient because it's difficult to fix. And yeah, it's different from Spectacle. It's like the silent stuff that actually works.
Well, I think that's what I really like out of some of these pieces from Matt and Gabriella, is like the ability to look at it as a larger system, right? So one of the pieces out of Gabriella's papers that I really enjoyed was the idea that these hackers were moving, were not just talking to each other, but they were building the systems by which they talk to each other, right? So those systems were sort of, it's sort of like Git was built for the Linux kernel. IRC was built for hackers to talk to other hackers. And so it fit them the best. It doesn't fit everybody, right? And I think a lot of Matt's work has been trying to define how do these systems get targeted by groups that are not the intended audience, right? So like if the intended audience of Twitter is nice people who share, you know, cat memes with each other, and then Weave gets added to the mix, right? Like that's now it's a different kind of system. and it has certain vulnerabilities you can almost enumerate from the way it was designed. And so I think a lot of that, yeah, IRC eventually, like you either have to dumb it down to Slack or it becomes unusable by a larger audience. Exactly. So I think some of these things I thought were interesting, like, I don't know that it's not very easy to get a history of IRC even that is understandable in that context, if that makes sense.
It's also important to note as well that even if you did have the history of it, understanding the nuances and the interplay between people has like the way we speak has almost changed as well. And so it's very hard to also fully grasp it, even if you can look at just the raw text.
Yeah, that's
so much, yeah, like so much is context dependent that gets carried over for days and days and days. So by the time you show up, there's like, did that thing work out? Nah, man. Like that's all you get, you know.
No,
So-
that's, I mean, one of the nice things about the project that Matt and I worked on was that it was historical. And so there was some distance, people were willing to talk. We could triangulate the interviews with primary archives. But the downside is that we weren't there, right? And as an anthropologist who has done research kind of live on IRC with Anonymous and Debian nerds and stuff like that, it's really different when you're there, right? You get certain types of like, you know, sensibilities and modes of interaction that is really, really hard to read in the future. And so like to your point, Grok, earlier about like how in the scene back in the 90s, there was, you know, a lot of really sort of angry teenagers who were kind of all over the place, right? And, you know, some of them I know became kind of professional hackers and upstanding members of the community. Others, I have no idea. And now this is kind of a question for you all. Like, was there a sort of divide even in the 90s where some folks were just like, that's kind of like lame and annoying, the sort of like teenage scene of people just sort of acting out? Like, was there commentary on that among some of the kind of hackers?
From what I remember, it was the opposite way around.
Okay.
Like it was the if you were like the anti-authoritarian spirit of hacking type person, then the becoming professional was really lame. I mean, as I said, I call it the great selling out. Like that was very much the view. Like there's no like, you know, we're growing up and those guys are not following us into like the real world. It was the other way around. It was like,
I mean, if you go back and look at hackers from 1995, like that was also an underlying thing in it too. Like Plague was the corporate suit, the guy who at one point likely had been a hacker, then sold out to the man and like lost the street cred from it.
Yep. And like,
no, this is helpful. This is what we seem to have heard, but again, we weren't there. So in some ways, that's precisely kind of what I wanted to hear, right?
I mean, so there was some of that, but then there was, you know, there was a bit of a catalyst change, right? Because while Plague went through that, Loft did not, right? When they became at stake and then sold to Symantec, right? Nobody batted an eye. So I guess my question would be, what do you guys think changed? Or did
it was generational, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Well,
in that
I mean, the
one-
Loft was very aware of this. I mean, they told us this, and then someone happened to give us their business plan, which was really nice because their business plan addressed this. You know, they're like, wow, we really don't want to be seen kind of as sellouts. So what do we do? You know, and so it was part of their strategy. And I don't think it was, you know, just done as a kind of like ideological veneer. I really do think that they cared about still having kind of connections to the underground or whatever, right? But they were very aware of this problem in a way that I think some of the earlier hackers were just like, I'm just going to do this, right? So that's part of the reason. But then also, you know, time had passed. There were more opportunities. People also were growing up, right? So between that generational shift, Grok, that you mentioned, and then the kind of deliberate strategy, maybe those two in concert help explain the shift.
But something
When you
happened.
mentioned AppSec, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they pointed out that Lawful isn't the only one. He's absolutely right, right? So, EI and Foundstone, the rest of them. But then, again, something kind of happened because for a while there was that silly meme going around about how do you become a cybersecurity professional? It was like, be an underground hacker, get arrested, be let off after 2 years for good behavior and then profit. So something in there in the culture changed, right?
Yeah.
Where it went from a sella to, okay, a couple of,
It was
notable startups, came out and made some serious money, and then it became memeified.
Well,
yeah. So like, as I remember, there's this like what. From my point of view, what happened was there was for a while a very, very small number of opportunities for people to go professional. And there was a lot of people who were, hobbyists essentially, or still in school and didn't have to worry about it, or, had a regular job that gave them the opportunity on the side, like sysadmin or something like that. Then as more and more people were making money doing security professionally, and at that point, the business side of it was different than it is now. Well, maybe not that much, but there was very much like FUD and then try and get money immediately. So there was like huge, like everything's falling apart, it's terrible, but I will save you right now for money immediately. It was a lot like that. And so there were a lot of people that were jumping into that and getting money. And the number of people who sort of got into the money side started to grow and grow, and there were people coming in straight into the money. Not as many, but so the number of people who were just hobbyists, so to speak, sort of started decreasing until there was this point where people who are coming into security didn't come through the scene. They went straight into, I guess, the security community, as it was at the time, where it was like just bug track. And, if you find an O-Day, you report it to a vendor and you get a job. And that is where anti-sec came from, which was there's another way. You don't have to do this. There is an alternative to, just turning over all your stuff immediately. And that was the blowback. And then anti-sec failed because, when you're when you're out of school, and when you've grown up, and the alternatives are maintaining the spirit of hacking and hanging out with your cool friends on IRC, or getting a job and moving out and being able to support yourself. Getting a job tends to win in the long run very quickly. So
that's super interesting. And I was going to also bring up the influence of anti-security here, but I've as I'm looking at this stuff, I have kind of alternative thesis. In addition to that, I think that's totally correct. But I don't know if this is true, but this is kind of what I'm thinking about and entertaining, and I'd be curious what you guys think about it. But I think also, so in our report, we described this kind of loft-led process as security by spectacle, because they use spectacle to put things on the agenda and then configure what security is, right? It's interesting because anti-security had a similar kind of approach where they really courted spectacle, right? But as it kind of developed more and more excesses, with Project Mayhem and eventually the White Hat Holocaust.
No, that was
so
the thing is the guys that were leading it created a movement that got taken over by extremists who ran with
exactly.
When you got the Frat High Council and all that weird shit.
Exactly.
People had long left by then. That wasn't the point. The whole thing was you don't have to burn bugs. That's it.
Exactly. So I mean, knowing that, it's really interesting to me how anti-security. Also was amplifying the message of Marcus J. Raynham, who had this kind of anti-FUD. He basically called that early security industry a protection racket, essentially, right? In some ways. So anti-security is kind of amplifying that, and also coming from the Qualys ADM side. There's another type of security industry possible, right? It's not opposed to the security industry, but there's another version of it. And then you start having the Elate and Project Mayhem and then so skip forward.
By the way, that's a knot. The tilde.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. I got you. Oh, interesting. Yeah, yeah. No.
Not aliens. That's
All
the
right.
joke.
Cool. That's cool. Yeah, yeah. I like that. I missed that. So, I skip forward a year later, right? And the first time like Wired writes about anti-security or any of these things is like an article titled "White Hat Hate Crimes on the Rise," right? And the message of because they Project Mayhem had evolved into the White Hat Holocaust, right? So, and they were like, spreading messages like save a bug, kill a white hat, right? So,
of angry young teenage boys.
Exactly. So there's also a thread here into the more kind of trolling, kind of stuff, and we can maybe touch on that as well. But so I think it's interesting because this kind of like maybe measured criticism of anti-security, although it was very convoluted as well, kind of was overshadowed by the spectacle of these outgrowths, and then that allowed people in industry to just write off the whole critique, right? As like, or that's like that's my thesis kind of at the moment,
The whole like angry teenage boys thing meant that like they didn't have to be taken seriously anyway.
Oh yeah.
That was like a lot of it is like, yeah, when you grow up, you'll change your mind. You'll get more conservative. There's people I know who are still, I wouldn't call them hobbyists because they've got jobs, but they're still, like underground from back in the day. Like they're real. That's how they identify. They don't do like infosec. Like there are people that were able to keep with that for their careers. Not many, but yeah. Like
quick question. And then I want to get to David's question. I mean, when the kind of teenage extremists took over anti-sec, was it in part because there wasn't kind of enough critical mass around the first iteration? Was this something that was upsetting to people? Like
the Fracite Council had been an IRC channel that was trolling. So they were already trolls, and they just glommed onto a new, like they took up a new mantle, right? So they existed.
Just one thing, I also know for a fact that one of the main anti-security people was also PHC and Project Mayhem. So just, I don't know what I can say on the record, but I'm just throwing out there.
No, so like there were like degrees of trolling. Like Gobbles was a troll, but like Gobbles got away with trolling in a lot of ways because of like technical capability, which is like you control the shell out of people. There were a very large number of people like Acid Bitches as a group, like they were incredibly trolling, and because they could back it up, they got away with it. Not sure got away with it is the right thing, but yeah, like they were able to, like people were, well, they do good work, which is how apparently we're supposed to criticize the allowing toxic people, etc. But yeah, anyway, so there was them. Then like the PHC, it was like this group of particularly toxic, like these days there'd be like incels or like on fucking 4chan or something like that. That was sort of like the quality that they had at the time. Whether they had those ideologies, I don't believe so, but that was sort of how they identified what they were like. And so like anti-sec started as this like, stop fucking selling out, like you could join the scene instead and you don't have to do it this way. And then like it started escalating, and it was sort of adopted more and more as a like, this is a cool thing to do. And they doubled down and like took it on. And I wasn't involved in it because I had nothing to do with PHC. Like it wasn't my scene. I had an onion on my belt. This was the style at the time.
One thing I wanted to ask Gabriella and Matt as well is that I think one thing that we talk about is like, what are the hard parts to talk about, right? Like so much of it is easy to talk about, like Loft or whatever, right? Like, so the other things that are harder to talk about, I think, are some of the government influences. in terms of like, if you pick the 90s and especially the late 90s, you start to see the rise of especially the US government and defense industries as they start to push into this space. And one thing that's often missing from, academic critique of this space is the idea that the hackers did come first. So I think that's refreshing in that your pieces start early enough that you can kind of see the hacker world influencing the government world, but then it sort of gets mixed up, right? So then the government world starts influencing the hacker world as well. So I just don't know how you can look at all these underwater currents and sort of figure out the sort of shape of the waters, if that makes sense. So I just thought I would throw that out there for y'all.
I mean, it's great, and it's something that Matt and I talked about. And again, it's a little bit this access issue, right? Where we did reach out to some government type hackers and only one got back to us, which was helpful, but not enough. And I think, Dave, you're absolutely right. Like, in this history, it's pretty clear that hackers in some ways were movers and shakers in the security world, not exclusively. There was obviously things going on elsewhere, but they were really important. But at a certain point, like the government and hackers working for the government and others become really important, right? And all I could say is that, one of the reasons we were really, really excited about publishing a 50,000 word piece of writing that was not a book was precisely the hopes that we would get this out there in order to, first of all, have people tell us, no, this isn't quite right, or you're missing this, but also to, ensure that the doors are open so that we can hopefully access those other parts, right? But you're absolutely right. There's always these missing parts, or a spotlight gets shown on a certain area, and that's where people go, right? So maybe we can talk about that government influence at that time, or like right after that time, because
that'd be really interesting. Also, just to add on to what Biella said, like, I see this report as like a draft in a way. I think history is always kind of a draft, right? Like you're not going to have all the information, and certainly when you're dealing with things where like co-option and like people's motivations are always very unclear, and that just gets more and more as you get into the internet age, honestly, you know what I mean? But I think like one thing I'm really interested in with this, and was interesting with this report, is just also trying to like tease out different dynamics, and like that you can then isolate and then think about how they could be, how those dynamics could operate today, or could be used by people, or just like how like understanding a certain like relation or like modality helps you understand what happened, even if you don't necessarily know all the facts exactly, And I think like, this is part of why I find the anti-security moment really interesting, because it's obviously a very convoluted and at times like ideologically incommensurate kind of thing. But it's really interesting to like tease out, like, some of the positions that these people were arguing for was that, that computer security or, cybersecurity should be basically a process led by civil society in some way, or by black hat hackers even, right? So it's just interesting to think about what would that even look like in practice, And then it's interesting to like think about how organizations like Citizen Lab, which came along much later and definitely was not influenced by anti-security, I don't think, how they actually do have a really interesting kind of civil society approach into changing the dynamic of what the bigger cybersecurity kind of equation is or something, right?
Do you ever feel like we're all trying to analyze like these larger, huge themes without ever focusing on the basics? Because in one of your papers, you're trying to build like a framework for how socio-technological societies exist, right? But that's very hard to do if you're looking at all the larger picture all the time, right? So like, if I was going to ask y'all a question about like a smaller primitive that sort of like fits in a little tiny piece of the puzzle, I would probably just ask about like the effect of pseudo-anonymity. I don't even know how to pronounce it, right? Because a lot of the hackers you talk to, you're giving their real names, right? And in some cases, in most cases, we kind of know the real names. We know K2's real name, for example. But it turns out in a lot of the interesting cases, you don't know the real names, right? Like, I don't think there's even a list of all the people who were in TISO, right? Like,
it was never actually defined.
It was never actually really defined, right? So like, so some of this stuff, even when you know the pseudonym, you don't know the real person and sometimes the real person, there were 5 real people behind a pseudonym.
Sure.
Right.
Or one person with multiple pseudonyms, right?
And does this make your work as defining these systems really complex? Do you find it like tilts it in a certain way?
I mean, I think it's definitely an epistemological challenge that you have to like be aware of. And I guess, again, that's why I think like, not to say that getting to ground truth isn't an important ambition, but that's why I think like understanding effects and dynamics and things like that is a more realistic ambition to some extent, right? Like if it's one person operating 5 accounts and like knowing that it's actually one person's perspective instead of 5 people's perspective can be really important, and you can postulate on that and the way that would change your interpretation without necessarily establishing it, right? So you have to have room to also interpret things in multiple ways simultaneously and assign probability, or maybe just be like, if this, then that, right? And it depends on what you're trying to do with it, right?
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, I think like anthropologists have often worked in situations where, let's just say, secrecy or anonymity are part of the social milieu and not just online. And certainly when I was doing a lot of research on Anonymous, I mean, it felt very difficult, right? Because I was like, what's going on? It's very hard to kind of, there's no way to verify a lot of things, right? But first of all, there were certain dynamics around anonymity that you could absolutely theorize. I mean, in the case of the Hacktivist Collective, they really were against behaviors where people amass personal fame. And I could see this like in front of my eyes, right? And people were kicked off channels or called out. And, so that doesn't get in the way because that is the very thing that's important, right? At another level, though, people would tell me things like, this is what happened in the lead up to the big DDoS against, PayPal and MasterCard when they were kind of supporting WikiLeaks in December 2010, and so I interview a couple people, they kind of say the same thing, seems legit. And then later on, someone kind of gives me a bunch of chat logs, which correlate entirely with what happened. Much richer in the chat logs, much more interesting. Like the secondhand account just doesn't get at like the granularity, but there is a kind of alignment, right? Now, if I had never gotten those logs, right, I'd have to go on people's word. And whether people are anonymous or not, that always presents problems, right? That's why journalists love documents. And why someone like anthropologists end up interviewing 30 people, right, to try to kind of triangulate. But nevertheless, you raise, core issues about like how hard it is to get at certain fundamentals, right? With distance and history, people are willing to talk a bit more, and yet not being co-present then has its limitations.
Also, just add one more thing really quick, like to your earlier question about the primitives and like a model or a framework or something. I mean, like this is an example where like just the possibility of someone like of a pseudonym being operated by 10 people or not, like memorably the Ross Ulbricht defense, hinged on the idea that there were multiple people who were Dread Pirate Roberts, right? So like that is I guess like in the socio-technical kind of model that, some colleagues and I are trying to develop, like that would be an example of like a primitive kind of vulnerability of a socio-technical type, right? And then the implications of that are, innumerable to some extent. But it's also interesting because that's also becomes a challenge for academia, right? As a historian or something, where, and of course, even when you do get the IRC log, how do you know for sure that it hasn't been tampered with? And so all these problems mount as digitalization increases and things too. So it's so at some point we maybe reach a point where like the consensus of 30 people who were there is more meaningful than one material document. And that's potentially a weird inversion as well,
In a few years, it's going to be that you'll say like, and of course, the video chat call could have been easily tampered with. So, like,
yeah,
that's where we're going. I wanted to sort of pivot and talk about broad things in a way as well. I'm curious about the evolution of hacktivists, in particular from the, I guess, the cycle of Anonymous, the rise of the cyber partisans from Belarus, and now the reemergence of a Anonymous of some sort in the Ukraine IT army. So I think that that's fascinating, and I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts. No, okay, great. So
I do, but actually, can we rewind a little bit, because now, again, for very self-interested reasons.
Yeah.
I've written a history, which is not really, well, a very rudimentary version is public, but a much more in-depth version is not public, but hopefully will be soon, covering a very particular type of hack and leak. And it's a hack and leak that is not, for example, when some anti-sec wanted to kind of expose and shame white hats, right? And they got their email spool and dumped them, right? I'm really interested in hackers who are like, you know what? We really want to get emails or other documents initially in order to kind of get them out to the public or journalists to expose wrongdoing. And then eventually that kind of tactic morphed into something that nation states started to use. And I'm interested also in the tactic where it was done very publicly, right? So there could be instances where people were doing this quietly and leaking information, but not kind of advertising that it came from a hack. And so I do kind of identify Anonymous as being key for not inventing, excuse me, but popularizing the genre and cementing it. And, some key examples also coming from 2009, one against the university in the UK where climate emails were published. And there was another one actually done by Jeremy Hammond, though he wasn't advertising it as such. And then a few other instances before that happened on 4chan. But now I'm turning it over to you to see, either to learn about either precursors, of which I have some as well, but really to kind of test my theory that it didn't really exist as a tactic to get information out in the public interest initially, in the 90s or early 2000s. So this is kind of like a question or a query before then we get to the present.
So directly on that, I don't remember anyone caring about journalists. So just like
right,
like the social conscious as a thing it wasn't on the radar with the people that I was in contact with. I don't know if that was elsewhere, it was prevalent, but not with what I knew.
And it's also interesting because there were some hacktivists either doing sort of like website defacements or of the sort that didn't come from your scene, like Electronic Disturbance Theater, who were doing DDoSing, but certainly there were website defacements. And so even the small amount of hacktivists weren't thinking that we can go find information on people's email or try to look for documents to leak to the public. And again, I'm just fascinated by this because it's so commonplace now, right? It's just happening all over the place. And oftentimes when I've proposed this theory, especially to journalists, they're like, oh no, this has really existed for a long time. I mean, long internet time. And I'm like,
Like,
no, really before
I was in-
2010, is really barely on the map, right? There's a few instances, 2008, 9, and then 2011 is a pivot point. And Matt and I interviewed some hackers who were like, again, owning systems in the 90s and early 2000s. And they're like, yeah, we actually had access to the emails of very powerful people. And we didn't even think about rummaging through them to find anything to like leak to the public, right? And I just, again, find this so interesting because now it's what a lot of hacktivists just do, right? And other parties.
The world that we existed in was full of hackers. It was not full of the public. So doing things that interacted with the public, just like it didn't occur to us because it was outside the world that existed. Like it,
very helpful.
If you didn't be impressed by like the fact that you were dumping a bash log, you didn't want to talk to that person, right? Like you couldn't care less what they thought, because if they didn't know what a bash history was, then they weren't really real. Like I don't know if you have this in academia where like, unless you have, you know how academics can be like such dicks about like, if you're not an academic, you're not a person. Like, it wasn't published in a journal, it doesn't exist, so I don't need to cite it. In fact, I can just copy it because like, it's basically free information that I found doing research. Not that I'm bitter, but like, like that's how we work.
I think it's moved away I think academics maybe moved away from that, or at least the parts that we operate in to some extent.
That's sort of how we were, at least as
meritocracy.
Yeah. So yeah, like the idea of like having access to someone powerful, like that was interesting just because other people that shared the same like views and knowledge as you would have found that interesting. Like searching through their emails and sharing it with the public would have never occurred to us, because the idea of sharing something with the public was just was completely foreign. It's like, who would do that? Why? Like that makes no sense.
Right. This is very helpful. And again, what I've heard, whenever I reach a new group, I ask, right? Because I do get a lot of pushback with my theory. I mean, Matt has seen it in operation, right? And I'm just like, no, I
pushed back on it at first.
I've done my homework, and anyway, so this is incredibly helpful.
So hacktivists, and in the last 5 minutes before we, we're gonna have to, unless we want to keep going, because I find this very interesting, but it's basically, I think we haven't opened it up that much to other people. So I'm feeling slightly bad about that. All right, so, okay, so we're gonna have to close out very quickly. I'm gonna throw it over to you guys to have the last word on the things that you're working on, and you're trying to get people to reach out to you. Like, this is a great forum to interact with people in the policy space, or who are basically have nothing at all to do with hackers, or this is probably the wrong forum for that sort of outreach, but I'm sure that people will be interested in what you found anyway. Maybe not useful for you to like go out and plumb them.
No, I mean, I think in some ways, what's clear is that there's gaps, right? And so if people want to reach out to us because they can help fill those gaps, they should definitely do so. And I do, I mean, sorry, I'm just reading the chat. I am fascinated by what's happening in the present, in the Ukraine context, where, I haven't been able to delve as deeply as I would have liked with the anonymous groups, but it strikes me that a number of them are quite new, right? They're not the same people. Obviously, a lot of those people are now public or have been arrested, although not everyone, in a kind of previous era. I'm like floored by, I mean, the number of leaks and dumps, and they're pretty insane, you know?
Mhm.
They're kind of like, I don't even know like what the implications are.
Yeah.
Right, anonymous groups. I mean, who knows really what's going on, right?
Well, there's like, I think that's one of the things that's really fascinating that I wanted to talk about, which was the like the use of the hacktivist cover, right? Like how hacktivist has become, you know, a thing that a nation state, for example, might want to use as a way of like getting things out to the public without having it linked back. And like I find like just that in itself is quite interesting, how it's another way that government has co-opted the underground, you know.
Sure, but what's interesting about that, if that's happening, well, two things. I could imagine that some enforcement agencies may not be so happy about that because it could be popularizing like hacktivism. Again, I could definitely think that it's happening. And then it also goes back to like what Matt mentioned, which is like effects, right? So if the information is not like being doctored and it's, you know, important information that's getting out there, in some ways, like who cares about the source, right? I mean, I'm not saying that in every instance because there can be very problematic dumps, right? But I'm also can imagine other ones where like, you know, if an agency wants to do this, right? And I also do have some information whereby it's not clear that, I mean, I don't know, maybe Dave could speak to this, but are there reasons why certain agencies wouldn't want to do that?
I mean, I think if we had another hour, we could talk about the dynamics between, you know, government interests as they conflict with each other versus outside interests. And maybe we'll schedule y'all for a separate, a second discussion, which, I mean, if you're open to it, I think is probably worth doing. You know, I wanted to ask one last question as well of both of you, which is y'all have done, the reason you're on this program is that y'all have done what I think a lot of people consider, you know, very good work in this space. But I want to know what surprised you about it.
I mean, I think this wasn't so surprising, but it's also one of these things where like, I wish we had been able to get more information to focus in on it more, which is like the European side of things, right? I keep saying this with a lot of my research. It's like Americans are so good at like getting themselves out there, you know? And maybe I was a little bit surprised at just how important some of the European groups I kind of knew, but there was that element. I also think that, you know, it wasn't so surprising, but nevertheless, just hearing about it over and over again. I mean, a number of, not everyone, but a number of people who were part of the scene were so focused on themselves, right? This goes to the boundary issue. I mean, the scene, not like themselves as an individual, but just the freedom of intellectual curiosity, right? And the satisfaction of being able to kind of build up a body of knowledge that's recognized by peers was something else that was not entirely surprising, but just the force of that was maybe a little bit surprising. Matt, is there anything?
I don't know. I'm really trying to think. I mean, I think I was surprised by a lot of things in the moment, but it's hard to go backwards and remember what they were, because now it all seems so, it's just, you know, on the
EU
on the
has
page
better
or whatever.
OPSEC. That's interesting.
So funny.
No, but that I really feel like
The Americans are loud and they like to talk about themselves.
always. Are there any Europeans here right now? Are we all American? Matt's Canadian.
Matt's from Canada, which is kind of a Europe. It's like
Yeah.
a semi-Europe.
It's still part of the Commonwealth, but is that Europe though? No, I guess not. No,
Europe
it's
is.
complicated. Yeah.
They speak French. I mean, that's pretty Europe. Oh, we are
Well,
over time.
I'd definitely love to have y'all back for a second phase. I want to get into the Nazi furries. I want to get into like what it's like coming from like, you know, well-adjusted communities and then talking to everyone who happens to be on the spectrum. I want to get into a lot like, you know, what would it really take to look at, for example, the Chinese influence on the hacking scene, which is not negligible, shall we say. Yeah, there's quite a few. I don't think we have to drill into particular people. I know the chat is like, what if we talked about various things? I don't think we have to drill into that. But yeah, disability and hacking, a lot of different things, you know, how this community is different. And, you know, there's so many open and I'll say academic questions that are not getting properly addressed. You call it anthropology, but I think a lot of people want to call it current events, you know, in a sense. They just want to predict tomorrow. They're having enough problems predicting the next 10 minutes. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, so I think that'll be awesome. And then I'd love to look also at the defensive side of things. I mean, Silas was relatively quiet here for the whole hour, but that side grew too. And how it grew and fed together is so interesting. Anyway, so I'd love to have y'all back. We'll have it put on the schedule and we'll make it happen. That's how I feel about it. And we're gonna ask you harder questions next time. So
Yeah, well, maybe we could have a session
prepared.
where Biella and I just ask you all questions and get a data dump.
Maybe. I mean,
It's also a nice hack because if it goes on the public record, I don't think we need IRB approval for it to cite it. So,
so, but yeah, I mean, just get ready. We're gonna, you know, assume that when you get on a podcast, we've read everything you've ever written.
Okay.
And we'll make sure that we ask you annoying questions about esoteric pieces of it. So
I'm down for it. I might have a
good.
second cup of coffee. I only had one this morning. This is great.
That's a fail. That's a fail. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming in as well.
Yeah, thanks for having us. All right.
Thanks for joining us. Before we go, I'd just like to remind everyone to, you know, check out NordVPN and, you know, support our sponsors. Bridge Wallet. Anyway, like, subscribe, all that stuff. It helps us with the algorithm. You know, as I mentioned before, we're really trying to move into the YouTube influencer space. There's a lot of us, and the ad revenue is just really not cutting it right now. So if you guys could go out there and just share with your friends, absolutely appreciate it. Cool.
Hi, everyone.